Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this week's Senate and House Republican Leadership Media Availability. As usual, we have with us today Senate Republican Leader John Braun, representing the 20th Legislative District, and House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox from the 2nd Legislative District. Since this past week has been mostly about the budget, we're also joined by the Republican leaders on both the Senate and House Budget Committees. Senator Linda Wilson, representing the 17th Legislative District, and Representative Drew Stokesbury, representing the 31st Legislative District. With introductions done, let's get started with Senator Braun.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Pleasure to be here. Week 12, we're square in the middle of budget season, and there's lots to talk about there. And I'll just hit on a couple highlights as they relate to our session priorities on public safety. I think it's important to know that the budget rolled out in the Senate funded important issues for us, like addressing the Blake decision, the pursuit issue, and funded additional training for regional training centers through the Criminal Justice Training Center Commission, that will help us rebuild our law enforcement community. Affordability, while there's lots to love and lots to didn't like less in the budget, I think one of the important things is two important things really. Is one, it's a no new tax budget. In fact, it has a few key tax reductions that we can talk about if you're interested. And it also grows by a more sustainable rate. Instead of the 19% growth rate we've seen over the last three bienniums, this budget grows by 8%. That reflects a little bit more fiscal conservative approach and a more sustainable approach that I think is ultimately it reflects a better level of affordability for folks around the state of Washington. And then on education, this is probably the area I'm most excited about in the budget. It does a few key things. It puts a considerable amount of money into ESSER grants for school districts around the state to get after the learning loss that we're struggling with over the last couple of years. It also adds some money for intensive tutoring and for additional math programs to help get our students back on track. And as we've talked about before, it has substantial funding for special education, something that we haven't gotten done, that Republicans have pushed for a number of years. And this gets us headed in a much better direction with raising the cap almost $800 million, I think just over $800 million over the 4-year into special education, as well as some funding to provide advocacy for the special education students. So I think this is a good reflection of our priorities. Again, not everything is as we'd like it. You don't get that from the minority, but I think our budget writers have done a good job in working to make our priorities for the state of Washington, which come from listening to Washingtonians around the state, reflected in the budget. So lots to talk about there. I'm going to stop now and turn it over to my colleague on the House side, Representative Wilcox.
Well, thanks very much, John. I appreciate that. And I'd like to recognize places that significant collaboration have occurred. You've heard me talk about that in the House, especially in Agner and housing, in business regulation. But over in the Senate, I think you heard about another good example of that in a budget that was collaborative, wasn't perfect, we know, from a Republican perspective, but included an sorry about that. Included an awful lot of the efforts of Senate Republicans. That wasn't the process here, and you'll hear more about that from Drew Stokesbury. I would like to highlight some policy areas. We're still doing policy over here. Today is a big day when it comes to criminal justice and public safety. We understand that the pursuit bill is going to be exec without a public hearing. I think that's disappointing because I know that at least one family of one of the victims of the tragic experiment that was passed a few years ago is planning on being at the hearing. And we heard quite a bit about the importance of process when we tried to bring a much improved bill to the floor that was collaborative in nature because there was 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans that co-sponsored. But that bill is not the one that is going to be advanced. And I think it's tragic that we're nibbling around the edges of a problem that is creating widespread issues clear across our state. I also believe that the Blake fix is going to be advanced, but it's going to be dialed back from the collaborative Senate approach to the point where it's probably worth passing, but has become more of a token than an actual fix. And I would invite you to talk with our public safety leads about that. I'll turn it over now to talk to Drew Stokesbury, our operating budget lead.
Well, thanks, JT. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Busy week here in the House and in the Senate. The budget came out at noon. It's about a 1,200-page budget. It's got a 300 or 400-page summary, and it's got a 50-page summary of the summary. It was heard a few hours later in the Appropriations Committee. We had about a 5-hour hearing last night. The agenda is to have a vote on that in the committee on Wednesday, and then presumably it will come to the floor later this week or next week. In contrast to the Senate Republicans' experience with developing the Senate operating budget, pretty disappointed by how the House operating budget turned out. While Chair Ormsby, was certainly willing to hear suggestions by me and my members, at no point were any of us invited into the room to make decisions on really meaningful structural items or some of the biggest problems facing Washington State. And I think you see that difference play out in the budgets themselves. While neither budget, to their credit, raises taxes, the House budget spends about $1.1 billion more over the 4-year budget period. And that's going to lead to some pretty unsustainable budget results. The state's Democratic treasurer recommends that we maintain 10% reserves. The Senate budget does that. I think their reserves at the end of the 4-year period are 10.2%. The House budget does not. Our reserves are only 7.2% at the end of the 4-year period. So that's pretty unsustainable and unwise, according to our Democratic treasurer. Also, maybe not the best approach in a time of a lot of economic uncertainty like we're facing today. While there are certainly a lot of good things in the House Democrat budget, just like there are some good things in the Senate budget, I think the problem with the House budget is that it tries to do too much. By spending $1 billion more than the Senate budget, it sort of spreads state tax dollars around like peanut butter, so that every little group, every little project, every little program gets a small increase in funding, but that leaves not enough funding to go to the state's most pressing and urgent needs. K-12 education is the state's paramount duty. When I first got here, we saw education funding quickly climb to over 50% of the state budget, but now it is now we're going backwards in percentage terms. The House budget, I don't think, fully funds special education to the level it's needed. It does not spend as much in special education as the Senate budget does. It falls short in other areas like funding dual credit course costs for high school kids. It does practically nothing to ameliorate the severe learning loss that was experienced while schools were closed and conducted remotely. And then in other areas outside of K-12 education, we hear a lot about the need for healthcare access, but we're not paying healthcare providers adequate rates so that there are enough of them to provide access to the people who need care. But instead of increasing Medicaid rates across the board, Democrats made only very modest increase that's probably not going to meaningfully expand access. And lastly, circling back to a point JT Wilcox raised about the pursuit bill, Senator Braun mentioned that the Senate budget does a lot with regard to trying to improve recruitment and retention of law enforcement officers. The House budget does not do nearly enough in my mind. We're among many issues in that space. One is the recruitment and retention problem. And I don't think the House budget does what it's going to take to reverse that problem that local police departments are experiencing. So while I certainly appreciate the lack of new taxes, I think the severe, dramatic increase in spending, and despite all that increase, not actually funding the areas that need it the most, were somewhat disappointing. And I got to believe that had this been a more collaborative budget, we could have obtained a result that looks a lot more like the Senate, which I think would be better for the people of Washington. So With that, I will turn it over to my Senate colleague, ranking member on the Senate Ways and Means Committee, Linda Wilson.
Sorry. Okay, thank you very much. Much has been said about this budget already, and so I will just kind of let you know that, well, some might have noticed that I did vote yes on the budget when we executed out of committee last night, along with 6 other Republicans. There was a reason for that, because we did, well, it's not a true bipartisan budget. It is I think the most inclusive budget proposal that we've seen in years. There is a reason for that, because me and Senator Gildon were at the table from start to finish, and very, very inclusive in the process. Senator Rolfes was very accommodating. We walked into this arena of the budget, I guess, with looking through 3 main measuring sticks. I guess I would say one of those would be the spending growth, right? And over the course of the last few years, it's been an average of about 19% every year increasing. And this year it's under 8%, an actual 7.9%. And although it is increasing, it is far smaller amount of increase than has been. And again, there's no new taxes in the budget. So we were in good shape before the budget, before we got started, and still good shape now. And then the other was a good reserve level. And at this point, there is a fairly sizable amount of as Drew mentioned, about 10.2% of the budget is in reserve. So again, there's many things this budget does include increased Medicaid rates. I think that's very important. We heard that across the board. I mean, all kinds of people coming in and asking about that. We had to do something about that, and they recognized that, and it happened. Of course, again, education with the learning loss, that was a very important topic for us, a very important policy area for us. Agriculture, we went in and actually got some voluntary funding for some voluntary stewardship and riparian zone programs. We worked out some important issues in the energy area, housing and work group. We're actually going to have a work group where we can be at the table and have discussions about what is affecting our affordability issue with the building of housing. We were very concerned about the pipeline of nurses, and so we covered much of that is addressed in there. Law and justice is one of our important things was the toxicology lab that needs to be funded fully. We've seen that across the board, how it affects all kinds of cases in the state of Washington. And then we're expanding lots of good things in here. Like I say, it would have not been the budget that we wrote, but very inclusive. And really, that's where I'd have to end there, is just how inclusive it was and how appreciative I was of being able to be at the table to weigh in on many of the areas in the budget. That's it. Thanks.
And with that, we'll go to our first question. Claire Withicombe from the Seattle Times, go ahead.
Good morning. House Democrats said yesterday that an expansion of the real estate excise tax is still on the table as we kind of enter this last month of session. I'm wondering what you all think of that idea. I believe it's House Bill 1628 that would raise the tax rate for homes above 5 million and add a local REIT as well. Thank you.
Well, I could jump in there. The REIT tax is going to affect the most, where the increase is going to happen would be in buildings that are such as apartment buildings. And when those get sold, then what happens there? Then the rents go up, right? This is not going to help. This is another, first of all, we don't need the money because there's plenty of money rolling in still. And that is what's going to happen with the REIT tax.
Yeah, I would like to respond as well. You know, if you look at the capital budgets, and it's important to notice that there's 2 other budgets that are rolling out this week, capital budgets in both chambers and transportation budgets that are highly collaborative. I think that both chambers put $400 million into the Housing Trust Fund. These are historic numbers. A few years ago, people would have thought that that was a fantasy. It was so high. In fact, there's some question about whether or not we even have the construction capacity available to efficiently spend those dollars. So what you're going to do here, I think, is create two problems. First of all, obviously increase the cost of apartment housing because you're taxing it. I don't think anyone believes that you get more of something by taxing it. And at the same time, probably increase the cost of building multifamily housing because of the dollars that are going in beyond the capacity to produce them.
Claire, did you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you though.
Okay. And let's go to Jerry Cornfield from the Everett Herald.
Good morning and thank you. I wanted to ask about the Blake bill. It is up for an exec today, and the substitute that's on the table would roll back the penalty for drug possession to what it is. Well, basically retain what it is today, a misdemeanor. The Senate passed version had made it a gross misdemeanor. I think Senator Braun, I wonder if you might comment on what you think. I mean, you've chatted about this in the past. What does that do in your chamber, do you think, in terms of the response? And does this make it impossible to pass in the Senate?
Likely so. I think we've just finished a 2-year tragic experiment with making this a misdemeanor. The reality is it does not provide the leverage that the criminal justice system needs to get people and keep people in treatment. So I don't think their vote, frankly, if I think it comes back in that form, there is a reconciliation process or whatever we call it now. So I think there'll be some negotiations and you might get it back to a gross misdemeanor, but I don't think it passes the Senate as a misdemeanor. I just don't think there are votes to do that.
If you maybe I could just follow this, Representative Wilcox, you had called it a token, but worth passing. I wondered what you meant by that. It sounds like some of your members would support it, even though it's not the full deal.
Well, I would support moving it out of the committee into rules, and then you will see a strong effort by the House Republicans to restore the effectiveness that's necessary. And, you know, I've said this, and that's why it's worth advancing, because it gives us another chance to, you know, let the full House, Republicans and Democrats, collaborate and vote on it in a way that would allow it to be improved. And as I've said many times, there's nobody that thinks that the first and primary response to addiction should be law enforcement and incarceration. But to nearly take that off the table is a huge mistake and already has had tragic consequences.
Jerry, did you have anything further?
I guess I would also be interested, just the other issue today yesterday out of the House Democrats was their willingness to accept the governor's bond proposal. All four of you have been around long enough to know what are trading pieces and negotiations. I wonder what your analysis of what the House Democrats want to keep that alive and whether you have sensed support to put it across the finish line in the legislature.
No, just to be clear, I don't think there's support to put that to put that in law. I mean, people look at that and say, look, this is a big, expensive proposal the governor has put forth that has no grounding in success. He just invests more money in the same programs, and he thinks, you know, that is somehow you know, that indicates leadership on his part. Let's be clear about this. The homelessness issue in our state, which is the worst in the country, has been entirely on Jay Inslee's watch. He failed to notice it for the first 10 years and then has been fairly inept at responding to it since then. The housing issue we have, the cost of housing in our state, while in fairness, that happened before Jay Inslee took office, he's certainly not done anything to make it better in the last 11 years. So the idea that all of a sudden he's going to wake up and say, his corny saying, let's go big so people can go home. How about Jay Inslee, you do your job or go home?
Well, I will give you another kind of answer as well. You know, we all talk about member management in caucuses. I think for the Democrats, this is governor management. This has not been a perfect session for the governor. I think there's a number of places where he's been disappointed, often by members of his own party. He had 2 years of experience in being able to get his own way through executive action, and this year isn't going quite like that. And I think Democrats are doing whatever they can to manage the relationship with the governor. And I would expect that in the end, this $4 billion doesn't happen. And as proof, I would offer the fact that these vast sums are being poured into the capital budget, from the capital budget into the housing trust fund. If they intended to do an additional $4 billion bond, you probably would not see them cutting their own capital budget priorities in order to fill up the housing trust fund.
And just building on both of that, agree with what Senator Braun said. Boldness can often be a good part of a plan, but boldness alone is not a plan. We need a plan, and a plan is more than just saying we're going to be bold. The people of Washington want solutions, not just throwing more money at the same thing. $4 billion to keep doing what we've always done isn't going to solve the problem. What the people want, what we need to do is clean up the streets. This is a problem, as Senator Braun alluded to, that has grown and existed entirely on the governor's watch. House Republicans, Senate Republicans have had bills over the years to prioritize cleaning these encampments up, ensure that there can't be these dangerous encampments right next to schools and parks and playgrounds and courthouses. Those bills have not gone anywhere. So I think to the extent the governor's office and House Democrats want any sort of progress made on a big and bold package, they need to signal a willingness to actually clean these encampments up and enforce the law. And I think until that happens, I don't see any reason to continue to invest more money to just have the same failed results.
And I think one more thing is that this also has to go to the people for a vote. And I don't think the people have the stomach right now to allow the state to go into further indebtedness. So that alone would cost, to use this $4 billion would cost the state $2.5 billion in interest. So we've got to have, and there's very few parameters around this bill. And I just heard this morning that the homeless rate has gone up 10% in the last 2 years. So that's another 3,000 homeless people. And like they said, all the others said, he's been in control for almost 11 years now. And I think for him, it's like, don't put off till today what you can do tomorrow. I think now all of a sudden it's in your face. There's nothing, you can't get around going pretty much anywhere without seeing homeless camps. And we've put a heck of a lot of money, billions, into this already, and the problem continues to go up. So there you go.
Okay, our next question will go to Joe O'Sullivan from Crosscut. Joe?
Hi, thank you. I just want to go back to the Blake bill for a second. Just curious from the leaders. I mean, is there any scenario where the legislature deadlocks and this sunsets in July of what we have, and you've got to start over again next year, or is it just going to be like something has to get done regardless of whether anybody's satisfied with it or what anybody thinks about it?
Well, we have certainly want to get something done. Don't mistake our concerns with the current bill with a lack of desire to solve this problem. And I think that's well evidenced by our work on the bill in the Senate. This is not the bill we wanted, but we negotiated. We worked hard on that. We provided votes to get it off, through committee off the floor. So I think we have a strong record of working to solve the problem. But at some point, if it's just a fig leaf, if it's just a token, as Representative Wilcox said, that does nothing, we're not interested in putting our names on this. So this hangs entirely around the neck of the in this case, the House Democratic leadership. We've come a long ways. We've negotiated in good faith. I think that's true of both the Republican caucuses to solve this problem. In the end, the majority has to act and act responsibly to solve this problem. So do I think it could not get solved this session? Well, I'm certainly hope that it will get solved, but I'm not 100% sure based on the most recent actions and communication on this.
Yeah, and I would say that if we were not interested in a real solution, we'd be doing what the House Democrats are doing right now, and that is advance a bill that doesn't address the problem, but allows you to say that you voted on a fix to Blake. We're going to keep working hard on this. The human cost is too high to do something that is not effective, and it would be a dereliction of duty to give up at this point. We're going to keep trying, and it may come down to the very last day.
You know,
All
we
right.
even tried, sorry, we even tried to get fentanyl to be a felony in the Senate, and that wasn't, and that is right now the scourge of what's going on in our country. Fentanyl is hitting our kids now. We have people, kids in Clark County, well, all over, but I know at least in Clark County, we've had 75 kids right now that have overdosed on fentanyl. And there's a bill out there that would fix that prosecutors want, and that's not happening either. That was killed in committee in the House as well.
Joe, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, one more for Senator Wilson. I think you mentioned something about a housing work group. Is that something taking place now, or is that for the future? Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and what all is going on with that?
Yeah, that was just a priority that in an area of housing over here in the Senate that was for the Republicans. It's going to be a task, at least right now, what's in there. It's pretty broad. So it's a task force to discuss affordability and the reasons why and regulation and why housing is costing so much. So it's a task force that, like I said, parameters are kind of broad right now, but that's a good start anyway to have us all sitting at the table to try to figure out the answers to this, because right now Democrat answers are not working.
Hey, Joe, I'd like to take your question and take advantage of it to give you a little bit of a highlight for, some really good collaboration that's happened around housing, and we should all be proud of Republicans and Democrats. First of all, I've mentioned the $400 million that both capital budgets have. Next, we've seen the lot splitting bill come out of the House and hopefully come out of the Senate. We've seen the ADU bill come out of the House, hopefully come out of the Senate. We've seen middle housing go through a very complicated process and hopefully go through the Senate. In every single case, you've seen the four caucuses stand up to people sort of on the edges and both sides of this issue and govern towards the middle. That's a pretty big thing, and it's a place where we failed over the COVID years to come together. So I want people to celebrate that. This shouldn't be about whether the governor gets his $4 billion. It should be, and one other place that we have also collaborated on, that's recognizing that there are features of our permitting system that make it hard to build in a timely way. And Republicans and Democrats have collaborated on recognizing that and rolling some of that back as well. So huge successes. If the governor doesn't succeed in getting his favorite object here, he should be celebrating the successes as well.
Did you have a follow-up, Joe? Anything else?
No, that's it. And I appreciate
Okay.
the context. Thank you.
You bet. And then let's go to Laurel Demkovich from the spokesman. Go ahead, Laurel.
Thank you. Good morning. I believe I've asked you all this before, but I was hoping to get some fresher thoughts on the hospital safety net, especially now that the budget has been released and the bill on that has been dropped. Is that still a proposal that you support as it is now? And is that something that you think, will do enough to help the hospitals financially?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think I certainly support it. I'm signed on to the bill. I think it's a positive step. It will help close the significant gap we have in funding our hospitals, with our Medicaid rate. It addresses the issue of the current hospital safety net, which is going to phase out over the next couple of years. And it gets and as part of the negotiations, it also makes a significant investment, or the hospitals make a significant investment in the stuck in the hospital issue that we've struggled with. It includes a pilot to try some of the things that have been successfully worked at Harborview to get people out of the hospital, get patients out of the hospital to a more appropriate setting. So I think, as in all big complicated bills like that, I don't know that everything is perfected just yet, but I think it's a step in the right direction. It's one that we need to keep both our large and small hospitals solvent and providing the important service they do to communities across the state. So I think it's a step in the right direction.
On the House side, I agree with what Senator Braun said. I'm also a co-sponsor of, I think it's House Bill 1850. That is the new proposal that was just released the other day. So I, as a co-sponsor, obviously support it. I'm not sure it is quite as helpful as some of the hospitals were originally hoping, but I know that the Hospital Association supports it. Like Senator Braun said, it is certainly a big step in the right direction. As to whether it will permanently fix the problem, I'm not a hospital CFO. I don't know. I sure hope so. I'm optimistic, but it's also not something that we can just pass the bill, pass the budget, and then assume that the problem is solved. We need to continue working on it. And like I said a minute ago, in addition to these kinds of issues surrounding the hospital safety net assessment, we also need to keep increasing Medicaid rates. The majority party likes to talk about access to care, and that really is important. But creating all the patient access rules that you can doesn't do anything if there's no providers that they can access. We need to pay doctors and nurses and hospitals and clinics fair rates so that they are actually open and able to take in the folks who need care, so that the folks who need access can actually have meaningful access. And until we keep raising Medicaid rates, I'm not sure that we're going to totally solve the problem that we have.
Laurel, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, on a different topic, I'm just hoping to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on what's included for education and special education in the proposed budgets. Obviously, schools have been struggling the past few years. Is there what's in the proposed budgets right now? Is that, what you support? Is there more that you think needs to be included or added into that to help schools to the extent that they need right now?
Yeah, Laura, appreciate the question. The House budget, the amount of funding for special education essentially funds the fiscal note that was attached to the, I don't know the bill number, but it was sponsored by Representative Paulette. We had extensive debate on the floor on that topic. I think we've discussed it here as well. House Republicans were in favor of making special ed funding a priority. After all, it's part of K-12 program of basic education, which is the state's paramount duty. And we felt like that is something that should be funded first and foremost. And after that's funded, then you begin to look at what the state's other needs and priorities are. But the House Democrat budget funds the smaller version of the Paulette bill that passed the House floor. And while, again, that's certainly another step in the right direction, I think it's still a long ways from being adequate to what school districts need to provide for kids in special education and with IEPs. So that was a bit of a disappointment. The other disappointment was hardly anything being done to ameliorate the learning loss that occurred. I think the Senate did a bit more. I think you'll see some amendments coming from the House that are aimed towards creating programs for districts to deliver to students to address some of that learning loss that occurred. And so again, kind of disappointing that some of the programs that would actually improve student learning outcomes were either underfunded or not funded at all. And at the same time, there was $1.5 billion for increases to teacher salaries. And not that teachers are unimportant, but teacher salaries in Washington State are already about first in the nation. So I remain mystified why we continue to double down on things we're already really good at while we neglect investments in things where we're falling far short.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think progress in both chambers. I'm pretty pleased with the progress in the Senate, about $800 million to special education, about almost double what's in the House Democratic budget. I think the House Republicans have been rock stars on this issue, fighting for for additional funding for special education. I want to be clear, none of this gets us all the way there. This gets the cap to a more reasonable spot. The Senate proposal also has some additional language to address high need students for small schools to get you above the cap. But there's still the issue of the gap between the ratio funding and the safety net and the size of the safety net. So we're not done here, but either way, in any of these scenarios, it's a big step forward. I think the Senate proposal was a bigger step forward. And then, of course, the other thing that doesn't get noticed as much, but I think is hugely important in the Senate proposal is the funding for advocates for special education children. You know, if your parent or friend or family can advocate for a special education student and get their learning education plan in the right place for them, that's great when that happens. But some kids don't have that kind of support network. Building out a system that provides advocacy for these students are going to help them get the plan they need and they deserve, and help them be more successful in life. So I'm very proud of that part of our proposal, and we'll continue to push, and we'll have some success making that the final budget that comes out of this session.
There's also, as I mentioned last week, the money that OSPI still has, the $100 million that needs to be spent by September of 2023. So I'm hoping that money will get rolled out, and because that was earmarked for learning loss as well.
Okay. We have one question left, and that comes from Drew Mickelson from King 5. He was unable to join us, so I'm going to read his question. Do you expect Democrats to pass the ban on the sale and manufacture of so-called assault weapons? And do you think the Nashville school shooting helps the bill's chances?
Well, I'm in law and justice, and in about an hour, we're going to be voting on that bill. And by the way, it is a modern sporting rifle, not an assault weapon. Those are already illegal in the state of Washington. But why are we looking at this? And why are we doing this and removing the rights of law-abiding gun owners and the ability to defend yourself, law-abiding citizens, when we're looking at other bills that are coming through that are going to be lessening these sentences to firearms crimes? I don't understand. There's a real disconnect here. And so you're going to lessen the crimes of the criminals and essentially make law-abiding citizens the criminal, or just give them the ability, take away their ability to defend themselves. So, unfortunately, there are shootings all the time, and but I'm really disappointed to say that what they plan on doing here isn't going to address that. We have a mental health problem, and we have a drug use problem, and we have got to start addressing that in order to get where we need to be.
Okay. It looks like we're all done with questions. Senator Braun, would you like to wrap things up for us?
Sure. Thanks, Kim. And thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the questions. I think hopefully we had a good discussion. We're gonna, as we roll out of through the next few weeks, we're gonna stay focused on the same things we've been focused on: public safety, affordability. How do we make Washington affordable for middle income Washingtonians? How do we get our kids back on track when it comes to learning loss and education? So a lot of work to do. I think we've got some good progress in the last week with the budget work. We're going to see what happens through policy cutoff, and then we'll take it from there. Thanks again for being here.
Well, as always, I want to thank you again. Also, there's never been a time when the press was more critical, I think, than right now. And I encourage all of you to not give up. It's a hard job. Sometimes I think you and we in the legislature, especially in the minority, have a lot in common. Next, I'd like to encourage you to pay attention to the House Public Safety Committee. I think it's got a different name now. It changes every 2 years. But those bills are important. They make a life and death difference to people in our state and their families. There's going to be family members there to watch the vote. They deserve to have their names spoken. They deserve to have their stories shared. I hope you'll do it. Thank you.